Is taxation theft? Today, we will figure out the answer definitively. With me to discuss are Professors Philip Goff and Michael Huemer. Before we launch in, I would like the two of them to just introduce themselves for anyone who doesn't know who they are. Philip, you first.
My name is Philip Goff. I'm Professor of Philosophy at Durham University. I spend most of my time thinking about consciousness and the ultimate nature of reality.
I'm Michael Huemer. I'm a Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I do a lot of epistemology, ethics, political philosophy. Everyone should go out and buy my book, The Problem of Political Authority. Right. Oh, and also buy my Introduction to Philosophy, which is Knowledge, Reality, and Value.
Oh, yeah. So seeing as Michael said it, my book, Why the Purpose of the Universe and Galileo's Error, both nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but you should buy them anyway.
Okay, great. So I think the two of you have some opening statements prepared.
Okay, so I have a brief little slideshow about whether taxation is theft. Okay, so I'm going to go through a simple argument that taxation is theft, very straightforward. I'm going to talk about some objections, and then I'm going to talk about what the implications are if taxation is theft and why that matters. So this is a simple argument that taxation is a form of theft. Taking other people's property without their consent is theft. And taxation takes other people's property without their consent. So taxation is theft. The first one looks like it's just, the meaning of the word theft in ordinary English. The second premise just seems like an accurate description. The government doesn't ask you if you want to pay taxes. They force you to pay. If anybody else was forcing you to give them money, and, if they said, hey, we're going to provide you protection, now you have to give us some money. Otherwise, we're going to kidnap you and lock you in a cage somewhere. You would not have any problem with saying that that was a form of theft. So it looks like taxation is a form of theft on the face of it. These are some objections that somebody might give. So first objection, maybe it's not theft because the government is providing valuable services in return. And thieves usually do not provide valuable services in return. If somebody mugs you on the street, they just take your money and run away. They don't give you anything. And in response, providing valuable services in return doesn't prevent something from being theft, right? So suppose that I'm going around mugging people on the street. I take their wallet, I take the money out of it, and then I take that money and I give it to charity. So I'm helping the poor, which is similar to government social welfare programs. I would still be a thief, right? And like even the government would agree that I was a thief and they would prosecute me, and they wouldn't say, I wouldn't get off because I was doing something good with the money, right? Or alternately, consider when the mafia collects protection money from people, they actually provide you protection from other criminals. So, like if another criminal is messing with you, you can go to the mafia boss and he'll fuck them up. Okay, so they are actually providing a service in return for the money. Why is it theft? Well, because they're still taking your money without your consent, right? Like they can't, if they force you to buy a service, well, that is a form of theft if you didn't voluntarily choose to buy the service. Okay, here's a second objection. Maybe it's not theft because we agreed to pay taxes. This is the social contract theory. And so this is a popular theory, I think, because people are taught this in their high school civics courses. I think that's the only reason why this is a popular theory. And I think that basically nobody, the people who say this have not thought about it for, like 10 seconds. Because if you think about it for 10 seconds, you notice that, oh, wait, no, we didn't. No, actually, nobody ever came and offered to me a social contract and I never signed it. And nobody ever said, oh, do you want to have a government? If yes, check here. If no, check there. No. If you don't want to have a government, what are you supposed to do? And, like if you say you write a letter to the IRS, at tax time, and you say, dear federal government, I don't agree to have a government, so please return all of my tax money. You're not going to get any of your money back, right? And, if there's anything that you know about contracts, it's that if you explicitly say that you don't agree, then you didn't agree, right? So, okay. Anyway, the ways that people sometimes say that you agreed to the social contract are things that no one would take seriously in any other context, right? So how did I agree to this social contract without noticing that I was agreeing? And then people will say something like, oh, you agreed by living in the country. You agreed by living in your own house. And, if you don't agree, you have to move to some place that doesn't have a government, like Antarctica, right? And, imagine that I say everybody has to pay me $1,000. Otherwise, they have to get out of their own houses and move to Antarctica. And because they're not moving to Antarctica, that means that they're agreeing to pay me money. Okay, so no one would take that seriously. All right, so let's assume the social contract theory is wrong. Third objection, maybe taxation isn't theft because it's not illegal. And maybe the government just gets to decide what the property rights are. The government produced property rights in the first place, and so it's up to them to just stipulate that you don't have a right to the property that they want, or like you don't actually own the money that they're going to take as taxes. It's really theirs, so they're just taking their own property, not yours. So in response, I think we have natural property rights, meaning I think that we have property rights that are not created by governmental law, right? So here's a hypothetical example that most people find intuitive. So let's say, you go out in some remote wilderness area, which is outside the jurisdiction of any government, and you meet a hermit who is living there by himself in the wilderness, and he's built a house, and, he's made some crude tools, like he's got a spear and whatever and stuff in his little hut. And you show up and you just decide to move in to his hut. And then, just you paint it green because you like green. And then you just start using the stuff in the house. And then when you leave, you take his spear with you because it's cool. All right. Did you do anything wrong? And so these are all things that would be okay to do if it was your hut and your tools. And they would also be okay to do if they didn't belong to anyone. So if you found a hut out in the middle of the wilderness that was obviously abandoned, and maybe the owner died a long time ago, then it would be fine to paint it green and move in, and be fine to take the stuff inside and whatever. It looks like it's not okay to do it in this case, which most people intuitively agree with. So it looks like there are some property rights. And because this is a person living out in the wilderness, those property rights couldn't have been created by the government, right? Because we're stipulating that this is not within the government's territory. Okay, now, many people think, and plausibly, that there are also some aspects of property rights that are conventional. So I'm not saying that property rights are completely natural, right? I'm saying there's some core notion of property, like in that example of the hermit, but there are also some aspects of how the property rights should be defined that depend upon the conventions of a particular society. So for example, we have patent law. It's not obvious that the norms governing patents are universal, right? So there could be another society in which maybe they don't have patents, or maybe there could be one where maybe they would have patents, but there would be a different term for the patents, right? Because whatever it is, 20 years, maybe there would be one where it was 10 years or something like that. Okay, and those wouldn't be violating people's natural rights. So there are conventional aspects of property. But my argument doesn't require that property is completely natural. It only requires that there's some natural aspect of property rights, because typical cases of taxation violate the core natural aspects of property rights. So the government isn't just infringing on these sort of optional conventional property rights. They're not just infringing on your patents or intellectual property. They're taking a share of your income from any source, whatever the source is. So, if you accept anything as a legitimate way of acquiring property, the government is going to take a share of that. All right, so if there's any natural property rights, it looks like they're violating them. Okay, fourth objection. Well, we need taxation in order to provide law and order. So, surely that's enough of a justification. Otherwise, all social order collapses, and then people would be killing each other in the streets and, cracking each other's heads open and whatever. So in response, first, that doesn't stop it from being theft. So saying that you're doing a thing for a good purpose, like you're going to produce some good consequence from it, doesn't stop it from being a theft. And so like in the case, in my charity mugging case, where like I'm mugging people on the street and then I give the money to charity, that's a good cause. So I'm producing good from it, but that doesn't mean that I didn't steal the money. Second response is, well, it's not obvious, actually. It's not obvious to me that you have to have taxation in order to have a government. What if the government funded itself by charging fees for its services? I don't see why this is infeasible. So, it could be that the government, so they're providing protection from criminals. They could charge money for that. They could, and so, a particular neighborhood wants to be patrolled by police, and then the government could charge that neighborhood money. I don't know why that's not feasible. It could be that, an implication of this would be that if you don't pay, then they don't protect you. Meaning, if your neighborhood homeowners association, or maybe just you as an individual, didn't pay the fees, and then somebody commits a crime against you, the police won't do anything. And then, okay. But, that's just like all other services. Okay. So what if taxation is theft? What are the implications of this? And I have to talk about this because it would be easy to misunderstand. Am I saying that we have to therefore abolish all taxation? Well, that doesn't necessarily follow, because some property rights violations are in fact justified. So, in Les Miserables, Jean Valjean steals a loaf of bread to feed his sister's child or something like that because they're starving. Almost everyone thinks that was justified. That doesn't mean that it's not theft. Like it's a correct description to say he stole the loaf of bread. So that is a theft, but it's a justified theft. Okay. Or another example, in the literature is there's somebody who needs to be taken to the hospital immediately because there's a medical emergency, and the only car available is somebody else's car. And you happen to know how to hotwire a car, so you do it. And like almost everyone thinks that that's justified. And so it's not a theft, but it's a property rights violation, interference with somebody's property. But it doesn't stop being a property rights violation, but it's a justified violation. Okay, so taxation could be justified if, in fact, it's necessary to prevent a complete breakdown of social order. So then you might think, so what? Does that mean that this claim that taxation is theft has no practical implications? No, the implication is that there's a general presumption against taxation, meaning like we should try to minimize it. We shouldn't do it without having a good reason. So consider how there's a presumption against theft. It's okay to steal bread to feed your family. It's not okay to steal just for anything. Like you can't steal caviar just because you like caviar and it's too expensive to buy, right? So if we apply this, you need a good enough reason. So if you apply this to the practice of taxation, it's okay to steal money if that's necessary to prevent a complete breakdown of social order. That seems justified. But it's not okay to steal money, for example, to provide sabbaticals for humanities professors, right? Which is, that's an actual usage from the National Endowment for the Humanities in the US, right? Okay, and then, you might wonder, well, what about wealth redistribution, taking money from some people in order to give it to the poor? Well, like, can I just go and steal money from people in order to give it to Oxfam? It seems like I can't do that. So I think most people, and not just libertarians, I think like most ordinary people would say, no, I can't do that. So that suggests that that's not a good enough reason for theft. And so then that would mean that it's not okay for the government to steal money to give it to poor people in the country. Okay, so concluding thoughts. Taxation is a non-voluntary property transfer, which is otherwise known as theft. This doesn't automatically rule it out as being unjustified, but it makes it harder to justify. So there are fewer things that we should use taxation for, and we should probably cut the government's budget a lot because of that. Okay, that's all.
And now Philip.
Okay, I'll go. So as is already clear, I think thinking about this question, we need to think really carefully about the nature of property. So I'm going to try and do three things here. I'm going to outline my own favored view of property, which is a social constructivist view, and defend that against certain criticisms Michael has made of such views. Then I'm going to critique Michael's justification for his Lockean view of property rights, that is the view that property rights are natural, that he's made in other places, if not here. And then I'm going to briefly outline my own general political view, which I call non-revolutionary anti-capitalism. Okay, so I think property rights are social constructions. I think that we make them up, right? And because we make them up, we can shape them how we want, right? That doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. Doesn't mean we should shape them however we want. I think we ought to shape them to protect and promote things of moral importance. Most fundamental for me, it would be human flourishing, hence the picture of Aristotle here, who is into human flourishing. I think to live a flourishing life, you need a roof over your head, you need a certain amount of access to material goods, and you need certain material goods to be yours in the sense that nobody's going to suddenly take them off you without good reason. Okay, so we want property rights to protect all of those things, but I don't think human flourishing is necessarily the only thing we want to consider. We might want to think about fairness, we might want to think about desert, we might want to think about social contribution, and it's difficult weighing all these things. But now here's the crucial point, right? Here's the crucial point. When we're thinking about weighing those moral considerations, property rights themselves are not going to be among those considerations. Why? Because on my view, property rights are not fundamental moral considerations in their own right. They are mere social constructions that should be shaped to protect and promote other moral considerations. Jesus famously said, "The Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath." I think what he was getting at here, he was criticizing people who fetishized the tradition of the Sabbath and subordinated human happiness to it. And he thought instead, the point of the tradition of the Sabbath is to serve human beings. In a kind of similar way, I think we shouldn't, there isn't some independent realm of natural property rights that we should shape our norms to reflect. Rather, property rights are themselves social norms that should be shaped to reflect other things of moral importance. Okay, so how does this impact the question of taxation? Well, as I say, we make property rights up. We can shape them how we want. If we want to make them conditional on paying taxes, we can do that. That's our choice, right? And if we do that, then the property rights come already bound up in their very essence with taxation. It wouldn't be correct to say you have a certain amount of money or property until you've paid taxes, or at least continuing to have that property is conditional on you paying taxes, right? Should we do that? Well, as I say, what we need to be thinking about is these things of moral importance: human flourishing, maybe fairness, desert, social contribution, and we should be thinking about whether making property rights conditional on paying taxes protects and promotes those things. Now, this is a difficult empirical question. I'm going to, in a moment, give you some reasons to think. One could make an argument, a sort of utilitarian argument, that totally getting rid of taxation will best promote these things, these moral considerations I've referred to. I'm going to give you some reasons to doubt that. But notice, crucially, this is nothing to do with Michael's argument, right? That Michael's argument is taxation is wrong because it's my money, right? Or your money. It's the government taking our money off us. Notice that this makes no sense at all on a social constructivist view, right? Because in saying that, as he quite freely admitted, he's taking property rights as fundamental moral considerations. On the social constructivist view, that's just false. Property rights are mere social norms, social constructions that should be shaped to protect and promote other moral considerations. So really, this is what you've got to realize. The question here is, do we have a view of natural property rights, or do we have a social constructivist view of property rights? Okay, let me defend social constructivism against some arguments Michael's raised. Well, the hermit's objection applies to it. a slightly different view that Nagel and Murphy have in their book, The Myth of Ownership, where they say property rights are dependent on the law. I think what Michael said is a good objection to that, because, you know, we can imagine the situation in which there is no law. But if we're thinking of them as social constructions, I think we're not subject to this problem, because we can say, well, there are social constructions and can be social constructions in a society without law. Michael elsewhere has also made another objection. He considers what is correctly what is rather exactly my view, that there are no natural property rights. And then he says, well, still, we shouldn't have taxation because it involves coercion. And that's a bad thing. And my response to this is, protecting property rights also involves coercion, whether it's the government or whether it's private security bodies. You know, there's a lovely area of land just by my house with a river in that I pass every day, and I often think I'd like to wander around it, but it's behind a locked gate with a security camera on. If I could easily jump over that gate, what's going to happen? The owner's going to call the police and they're going to drag me away. So any system of property rights involves coercion. I think the term libertarianism is a misnomer. It's not about property rights or no property rights. It's, do we have a system of property rights that involves taxation or not? And this depends largely whether we believe in natural property rights or socially constructed. Oh, sorry, natural property rights or socially constructed property rights. Okay, so I've defended my own view, but that doesn't mean it's right. I now want to think about Michael's view that there are natural property rights. And this kind of view is influenced by John Locke, and it's very much a historical view of property, the right to property. Okay, so we don't look at a snapshot of society and just to determine whether people have the right distribution, whether we have the right distribution of goods. We look historically whether these goods were acquired in a just, legitimate way, and then whether they were passed on consensually. Right, that's what the Lockean system that I think Michael signs up to embodies. Now, I've read Michael elsewhere say that he justifies this because he thinks it's part of common sense morality, and he kind of hinted at that in what he said. I just think this cannot possibly be true, because the Lockean view is nowhere mirrored in the real world. Right, for the Lockean view to justify us having the kind of property rights we take ourselves to have, you would have to have had this beautiful, pristine history of property rights being passed on consensually. That is nowhere the case in the real world. In England, for example, where I live, half the land is owned by 1% of the population, largely because in 1066, when William the Conqueror, pictured here, conquered England, he took all the land off the peasants and divided it between his mates. You know, I have a friend who's a farmer who pays huge sums of money to a certain duke because his great-great-great-great-grandfather was friends with William the Conqueror. You know, before William the Conqueror, there was a much better system for peasants. Peasants could use the nobleman's land. William the Conqueror did away with all that, set up enclosures. So I think, you know, this has despoiled that perfect Lockean history of preserving ethical property rights, natural property rights. Also, the way the state in almost every society I know of continuously interferes in the market through taxation would again disrupt this historical Lockean process. I mean, here's a very concrete example, right? On a Lockean view, I would say a school teacher, if they're funded through taxation in a public school, does not have a right to their property, to their money, right? They're essentially paid out of stolen money. They do not have a right to that money. I think commonsensically, we think the school teacher does have a right to their money. So this shows quite straightforwardly, I think, that the Lockean view cannot make sense of our common sense ideas of what we have a property right to. Okay, so I think my own view of social constructivism has a better chance of making sense of conventional morality. Okay, so thirdly, I just want to outline very briefly my own general political view. People often say, where has socialism worked? And what I want to point out is in the post-war years, 45 to 75, in the US and Western Europe, we had semi-socialism. We had very high taxes at the top. The average tax rate in the US between 1930 and 1980 was 81%. In the UK, it was 89%. We had strong trade unions. We had a lot of regulation, and it bloody worked well, right? We had a very dynamic economy. Growth was on average higher then than in the decades later. And we had a massive redistribution of income, right? I should have got the US stats that are even starker, but I've got the Europe stats here. In 1913 in Europe, the top 10% owned 89% of everything. In 2020, they owned 56%. This is due to this massive social achievement of the post-war years involving this semi-socialist model that, this had been the case for most of history, right? A small number own almost everything. We managed to change that after the war, and it's being airbrushed out of history. So I think, that we then look at what informs my political philosophy, very empirical, look at these two eras of recent history, the semi-socialism of the post-war years, and then the neoliberalism of subsequent years, where low taxes, weaker trade unions, or low taxes at the top at least, less regulation. It's been a disaster, huge inequality, crisis after crisis, all came tumbling down in 2007, 2008. And I think since then, people have been grasping around, what is the way forward? Is it Trump? Is it Brexit? Is it Corbyn? And I really think we're at a very serious moment in history where we're either going to have to learn the lessons of recent history, or I really think we're going to get fascist governments in the very near future. I think there's every sign of that. So what do I mean by learning the lesson of history? Well, I think comparing these two epochs, the semi-socialism of the post-war years worked much better than the neoliberalism, more Wild West capitalism of the years after that. And so we need to return, I think, learn the lesson of history, return to exploring ways of democratically at community, state, and global level, taking back control of our economy. This was the slogan of Brexit, take back control. I think it was a good slogan. They were just the wrong target. Now, I'm not a revolutionary. I don't believe in an overnight revolution. We don't know what will work. The top-down economy of the Soviet Union obviously was a disaster. I think we need to carefully, slowly, democratically try out things. But, human beings are very clever. They have great ingenuity. I do not believe this system, or indeed the post-war system, is the best humanity can achieve. I think we need to have more faith in ourselves. I think if we put our minds to it, human intelligence can create a better way of running society. And I think, for example, Thomas Piketty, who I've got many of these stats from in his great book, Capital, and smaller books since then, has some great, well-researched proposals. For example, universal inheritance, where at 21, each citizen receives 60% of average wealth. So rather than just people with wealthy parents inherit, we have wealth not stagnating because
just 30 more seconds.
But instead flowing dynamically through the economy would be a really great way forward. So I really think we're either going to take a great step forward in using our intelligence to rethink society, or we're very soon, I think, going to have barbarism and fascism. And so it's a very serious moment.
Okay, thank you, Philip. We're now moving into rebuttal speeches. Michael, you have 8 minutes.
I don't know how to take these slides down.
Oh, yeah, I was muted there for a second. Okay, so there are a number of things I wanted to comment on. I'm not sure if I have time, but so first, I wasn't completely sure about Philip's view. So here are two related views. So one is that a sort of rule utilitarian view. So like the correct property rights are the ones where it would be most beneficial if we had this set of rules. And another view is the correct property rights are whatever the current actual conventions say. Now, if it's the current, if like to have property rights, you have to have the actual conventions, then I don't understand his answer to the example of the hermit in the wilderness, because there aren't, by stipulation, there aren't any conventions governing that, because he's just living by himself, right? I assume that one person can't establish conventions by themselves, and if they could, we just stipulate that he didn't, right? But he doesn't want you to take the stuff. Okay, if the idea is more of a rule utilitarian view, I have more sympathy with that. I guess I think that giving the state the right to take whatever money it wants, as much as it wants, like I don't think that that's the utility maximizing rule. I think that sounds to me like a really bad rule from the standpoint of the utility of society, because it seems to me like, well, obviously they're going to abuse that, and obviously they're just going to get lobbied by special interest groups to distribute more money to themselves, right? All right, so just as far as natural property rights versus conventional, if you have the real utilitarian view, I think that counts as natural property rights. The reason why it's not good, just in utilitarian terms, it's not good to have like some central power structure that gets to decide to take some of your money, from whatever source you got it, is, well, this creates perverse incentives. So it's going to, it's going to lower their incentives for the person who's earning money, but also like just think about the incentives on the people who are taking the taxes. That that they're just going to take what they want to serve themselves. There's the argument that due to historical injustices, nobody's property rights are actually legitimate on Lockean grounds. Now, Nozick would say, oh, we need to work out the principle of rectification, right? So, there's this theory about how you acquire property rights in the ideal situation when nobody's violating property rights. And then there's supposed to be some kind of theory about what you do if somebody has violated property rights. I don't know what the rectification is, given just like how extensive the injustice is in the history of property in general. I don't know what the right rectification is, but it doesn't look to me like the taxation is. So if you believe in natural property rights to begin with, I don't think you would look at the unjust history and then just say, okay, so nobody owns anything. I think you would sort of try to figure out, I don't know, and maybe if you have real utilitarian sympathies, you try to figure out, well, what's the best way of remedying this? But it wouldn't be that somebody gets to just take whatever they want and give it to whoever they want, right? Okay. I want to comment on the discussion of semi-socialism. Now, just sort of like as a semantic point, I don't call that socialism or even semi-socialism. So I think the word socialism refers to a system in which private individuals are not allowed to own capital. So the government controls capital. You have collective control of capital. And I understand that not to be what Philip Goff is advocating. So I wouldn't use the word socialism. And, okay, well, who cares? Why do I want to be the language police? But I think that this is an important distinction. It matters a lot whether the government is controlling capital or private individuals are. And it goes a lot better when private individuals are controlling it. And that's what we saw in the history of the 20th century. By the way, in the post-war period, so there were times in American history when there was like a 90% top tax bracket. I've heard that was misleading. This is what people told me, when I expressed amazement at this, that hardly anyone actually paid that, and that because there were sort of like tax loopholes, right? So it probably wasn't that much more of a tax rate than we currently have. I wanted to comment on the idea of, when you turn 21 or something like that, you acquire 60% of average wealth. This sounds to me like a horrible idea. This is just a complete disaster. I think this would destroy our society, more or less, because just the amount of tax that you have to do, and so I like, how is this funded? I guess it has to be funded with a wealth tax. Okay, so like there's somebody who owns an apartment building, and now, but like every time somebody comes of age, like 60%, that person has to get 60% of the average wealth. Like, what is the tax going to be on this? It's going to be prohibitive, right? It's going to be not worth it to anybody to acquire wealth because there's just going to be so much tax on it, right? And then, so what's bad about that? Well, then like the entire economy is going to crash. If people don't want to accumulate wealth, then there's going to be this thing where like you get some money, you immediately spend it so that it won't get taxed away by the wealth tax that's going to keep happening, right? And then there's not going to be investment. Like, you don't want to own a business, right? Because like, you're just going to work for a really long time and then just keep having the money taken away from you. Now, I'm saying all this because I'm assuming there's just going to have to be a huge tax rate, like much, much larger than we've ever had in order to finance that. So, okay. Good. Now, so that wasn't exactly the central topic of the debate anyway. But okay, so yeah, I guess that's all I have. I feel like taxation is like it's a kind of non-voluntary wealth transfer that we should try to avoid having too much of. Right? All right, that's all.
Thank you, Michael. Philip, to you. You have 8 minutes.
Okay, it's hard to remember everything. So I'm surprised it's kind of, I mean, I know I brought up a lot of empirical stuff. Well, I'm surprised Michael sort of allowed it to just change into an empirical debate. I was surprised that he said, yeah, so I think to clarify, I am thinking of something like a rule utilitarian position where it's the property rights are what best, the kind of rights that in principle best protect and promote these other goods. Okay, if he calls that natural property rights, I'm not going to fight over it. But that would seem to me to radically transform his view. So I'm surprised he says that in a way, like almost as though he's open to it. Because then, then if we decide on partly empirical grounds that we should that the best system of property rights involves taxation, then taxation isn't theft. So, so I'm surprised like his whole argument is set up in a way that he seems to be sort of conceding that it really collapses into an empirical question, whereas the way he set it up, I thought there was some sort of moral basis to his resistance to taxation that was not to do with these kinds of empirical considerations so straightforwardly. So on the question of, well, did people really pay this tax rate in the post-war years? I would recommend Gabriel Zucman, a Berkeley economist. He's written some popular books. I can't remember if it's his book, The Hidden Wealth of Nations or The Triumph of Injustice, where he's, I mean, to my mind, people can check it out for themselves, very systematically dismiss that myth that people actually, because there was a culture that there was less of a culture of trying to get away with not paying tax. Whenever in this period, there was a culture, whenever there was a rise, people's salaries went up in a company, people at the bottom went up higher than people at the top. Unbelievable now to think about it. That wasn't enforced. That was just the culture. And anyway, people can check that out. And the way it worked, by the way, right, these high taxes, they didn't take from the rich and give to the poor. How it worked is, it was a disincentive. It basically acted as a kind of a maximum wage because it acted as a disincentive on CEOs pushing for these higher salaries. So there was more money. It reinforced that culture. There was more money for workers lower down. There was more money for investment to create a dynamic economy. It really worked very well. And I really think we're sort of trying to airbrush this out of society. So look, if we've got rid of the worry about natural property rights, then it really is an empirical question. We just have to look at these two periods. What an astonishing achievement it was to create a middle class for the first time in history. And that was achieved through, look, I mean, I think really the question is, do we have social structures that make workers more expensive? Strong trade unions, high taxes at the top, strong regulation? Or do we get rid of all that and then through natural power relations, shareholders and CEOs are more expensive? We've seen their salaries shoot up. So the question is, right, where do you want most of the money we're making? Do you want it to go mostly to, do you want it to go more to workers, or do you want it to, obviously there's going to be some divide, or do you want it to go to CEOs and profit dividends? We can decide as a society through our tax systems, through our regulation. We can decide. In the post-war years, it went much more to workers. That's how you got this dramatic redistribution of wealth. Then from the 80s onwards, we have decided as a society that we want it to go more to the top. We've decided that. And it's a bloody mess at the moment. And this is why people are grasping around for, is it Trump? Is it Brexit? Is it, some other culture war? Because it's, I just think it's an absolute disaster. We need to learn that lesson of history. And I think these myths that, people didn't really pay tax then, if we even talk about it, people, I find people just don't know the tax rates that I just think these are myths created by people who don't want to see that change, that don't want to learn that lesson from history. What other things were we talking about? On the point of historical injustice and so on, 2 points. I mean, one, I was making a very specific point with that. My point was simply, Lockean view cannot get you common sense morality, cannot get you our common sense views of what we have property rights for. And insofar as Michael's justifying the Lockean view on those terms, I just think it doesn't work out. And the most stark example is, on the Lockean view, the school teacher does not have a right to their money. So it cannot get you Lockean money. So I was just undermining that justification. But look, so if Michael's open to a sort of a more left libertarian view, whether we think of property, if he's happy to think of property rights as in this kind of rural utilitarian way, and think about it rectifying historical injustice, then fine, I'm really open to that discussion. So I mean, why isn't he emphasizing in his work, let's have a huge land tax to take all the money off these dukes who have who own half of England. Well, that's not 1% own half of England. That's not all the aristocracy. There's also the church, and to redistribute. Let's get having that conversation. I'd be more open to that more. Where I think that the right-wing libertarian position really falls apart is when you think about land. If England was divided up equally, we'd each have an acre, so there's a serious injustice here. I think that the right-wing libertarian position kind of feels like it makes sense when you're thinking about contracts and your own labor. But what about land? Why does the Duke of Buckinghamshire have any more claim to the land of this country than me, right? So I think, we need to rectify those grave historical injustices where some people have acres and tens of thousands of acres, and some people don't have a roof over their head. Some people who, work doing very important jobs, care workers, scientists making cures for cancer, and actually, they don't have, some people doing important jobs like care workers who don't have enough money to live on, whilst the Duke of Buckinghamshire, great-great-great-grandparent with William the Conqueror, has tens of thousands of acres. So let's have that conversation. I'm curious as why Michael isn't kind of engaging that more. There are all these messes before we start thinking about, okay, do we have this perfect system of property where we can start saying, oh, maybe now if you tax, it's theft. Well, that's a very different world. And, and I do think we're at a very grave moment where we need to grapple these issues because, anything else I want to say? Socialism was the other point, the final point. I'll think more about that. Let's not get too bogged down in semantics. Piketty, who I mentioned, calls his view participatory socialism. And look, I just think there's a clear... There's on a spectrum, aren't they? I see. How much do you have taken out of the market? How much do you have run to the market? I would like to try slowly, conservatively. I'm a sort of small c conservative. See what we can take out of the market, what we can make work, as we did in those pre-war years. Oh, inheritance. I guess I'm out of time. I didn't talk about inheritance.
Just close up.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't talk about inheritance. Maybe we can get onto that.
Okay. No worries.
Okay.
So I think what we agreed on gives us about half an hour of open discussion between the two of you before you say your final pieces, if that's still cool. So I was hoping just at the beginning we could stick to the philosophy side of it, so you could sort out those disagreements first before you talk any more about the empirical side.
Right. Well, we probably will not
And over to you,
sort them
whatever you
out.
want to talk about. Yeah.
You talk about what? So like I don't know what the correct fundamental ethical theory is, right? So like my approach to ethics is largely relying on intuitions, my intuitions, but I try to take ones that are widely shared. But I have some sympathy with rural utilitarianism because, like not as a starting point, but because like actually it seems to do pretty well at explaining most of our intuitions, right? So maybe it's correct. I'm not saying that it's definitely correct, but it's a reasonable view. The reason why. Oh, okay. And so what it leads to is it's like a little bit hard to tell what rural utilitarianism leads to because it's not clear exactly what the rules are and how general they're allowed to be. Okay, but my general idea about how it relates to property rights is, well, okay, there's valuable resources. You want people to use them. And you also want people to do productive things, which create more valuable things. But people are selfish. So in general, you want the system of social rules to be set up so that people will be incentivized to do the valuable things, to produce value. And because they're selfish, they have to get rewarded. And so here's a thing, like, okay, there's resources, people are going to disagree about how to use them. There has to be a rule which will say who gets to decide. And you could imagine other alternative rules, but other alternative rules turn out to be inefficient. So there should be, somebody should be assigned as the decider for a particular thing. And who should it be? And well, it could be the person who's most responsible for creating a thing of value. And why is that a good rule? Because then people are going to create more things of value because they're selfish, right? They want to have control of those things. And if somebody else has control of it, then you reduce the incentives, right? You could say, well, somebody else could have control of a part of it, so then you reduce the incentives, but not by right. But the larger the portion is that somebody else controls, the smaller the incentives are. So anyway, okay. So that was the sort of the idea of the rural utilitarian defense of property.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not quite a rural utilitarian. I don't have a fully worked out view either, but I would be open to taking into consideration fairness, desert, these non-consequentialist notions. What my view is analogous to rural utilitarianism about property, right? So there's property rights have a derivative moral significance, right? They have their moral weight because of other considerations. Yeah, I mean, like I totally agree with you that there are these incentive questions, that's very important. But there's also this question of, and if you mess around with those incentives too much, then we're going to shrink the pie, right? We're going to shrink the pie of what we're making. But I think we know from historical experience that that there's a partially independent question of how much of that pie is going to shareholders and CEOs, and how much of it is going to the workers. And we've seen that shift over time, depending on what we do. And I've said, with strong trade unions, high tax at the top, that makes workers more expensive. That makes more of the money we make go down there. Yeah, you push that too much, you'll shrink the pie. But in the post-war years, we had higher growth. So we know we can do that. So I think it's about weighing both of these things, right? You've got to think about both of these things. And I'm a small c conservative in that I hate you might agree on this, Michael. I hate people fetishizing being a moderate, being a centrist, because what is a center? What is the center changes, right? I've got a friend who's in his 70s, who's an old school Tory. On culturally pre-Thatcher, On cultural issues, he's a little bit far further to the right. But on economic issues, he's kind of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, right? Because that was where the center right was then. It's come so far right. So, in the 70s, I would have been a centrist. I think we were on the right course then. So, I just think to me, it's just an empirical question. And yeah.
Good. Yeah. So I'm annoyingly skeptical about the empirical argument, right? And it's annoying because I don't have empirical evidence, whatever. I haven't done a bunch of research on statistics, but when people give me an argument like, hey, things were going well in the 1970s or whatever because of this, I'm very skeptical about their attribution of why were things going well after World War II? No, maybe it was just because of the end of the war, and whatever, and people were happy because of the end of the war, and also the government stopped spending a bunch of money on war, and they stopped blowing stuff up. Maybe that's why there was a big economic expansion. And I'm not saying that's definitely the answer. I don't really know, right? But okay, but I don't know. I just have a theoretical argument, so there's the thing about the incentives, and there's a thing that the people who have higher incomes tend to invest more of their income, a higher percentage of it. So that means that, if you redistribute money from the high income people to the low income people, then you're reducing the rate of investment, which reduces the rate of economic growth. Now, and, in the short term, it might seem like it's worth it because, there's diminishing marginal utility. So the poor people get more benefit from the money than the rich people would have. So in the short term, it's a benefit. But if you're reducing the growth rate, then in the long term, if you extend that over decades, that could have a huge impact on, how well off people are in the distant future. So it's plausible that the wealth redistribution would be overall harmful.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's something to that, certainly. But here's another consideration on the other side. The rich spend less, right? This was Keynes' insight, right? The rich spend less, and hence you have less demand in the economy. If you take a load of money and give it to poor people, they'll bloody spend it. And that's one way of getting the economy going, especially in a recession. So yeah, I mean, all of these things need to be balanced. Just on the question of, was it after the war? I mean, this was a good few decades, right? We had a healthy economy, 50s, 60s, mid 70s. We had an oil crisis in the late 70s, but prior to that, very few financial crises. We had a few decades of prosperity and society getting more equal, right? And well, I quote Piketty again. It's a more empirical argument, but he's done a comparison of surprisingly, perhaps US and UK had higher taxes in this period than the rest of Western Europe, right? We were in 1890, they were sort of in the 50s or 60s, and he's done a comparison, and this tax difference didn't seem to make any noticeable difference on growth. So that would be just in terms of the high taxes not impacting growth. I mean, look, I suppose I think the onus is on those who say, look, we need these low taxes. I think the onus is on them to really prove that when we had these few decades with high taxes. And I just think, look, things are not going well. Especially, why is the onus on them? Well, I guess it depends how much you care about equality. I mean, maybe, Mike, you don't necessarily care so much about equality, but from the 80s onwards, you had much, much less equal society with no more growth, right? Whereas in the post-war years, you had this massively, massively more equal society with more growth, with a little bit more growth. So the onus is really on people to make that case. But I agree, it's difficult. Knowledge is so specialized these days, and we've got to, just try and take news from a lot of sources and try and make our best judgments. But insofar as I've tried to look at both sides of the argument, that's at least where I end up.
Yeah, just on the point about the rich people spending less. So I don't think that spending is good. So, but but even if you do, then we could remedy that by monetary policy. So the government could print more money to increase the spending, if you think that's good, until they get the optimal amount, right? So, oh yeah, about inequality. No, yeah. So I don't worry about inequality per se. So I think it's bad if people's basic needs are not satisfied. That's bad. But if people, apart from that, just people being unequal, I don't think is bad. So I have a philosophical argument about that, probably going to take us too far afield. What is the reason? So I've heard that there's increasing inequality. I believe this in the past couple of decades. What's the reason for it? I don't know, and I think there isn't any general agreement. But I think it might in fact be that the people at the bottom are less productive relative to the people at the top. There's like we've had social and technological developments such that it's now more feasible for somebody to just make a huge contribution to the economy. But also there's a bunch of people who are not able to make big contributions. And the reason for that is like we need more skilled labor, and then there's a bunch of people who don't have the skills. So and there's just like less and less need for unskilled labor because we got machines and computers and stuff like that. And so like their productivity has declined. That's why they're being paid less, like rather than because of the government policy, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's difficult assessing these different explanations. I mean, I think very recently there's certainly some truth to what you say. I think there are ways governments can try and remedy these things by creating new industries, which they failed to do in the UK and the US, in the 80s and 90s. What was the point that led on to that? Oh yeah, I mean, I don't know. Look, it's just to my mind, right? We had this period where you had very strong trade unions, right? Very strong bargaining power. And then you had these high taxes at the top. And lo and behold, more of the money we make, same growth or slightly more growth, more of the money we make went to workers and less went to, CEOs and shareholders. Then we slashed the taxes. Thatcher slashed them from 80 to 60, 60 to 40, and then it went like that again. I mean, I don't know. To my mind, that's the most plausible explanation. But I don't know.
Well, I feel like we need an economic study, right? Because and so like looking at one event, sort of like the way that it just looks to casual observation might not be reliable. I don't know. I was thinking at some point we should talk about the land tax, because this might be a rare point of somewhat agreement.
Yeah.
Because when I say taxation is theft, actually I don't think all taxation is theft. So I had a blog post in which I said, well, there are two kinds of taxes that may not be theft. And one of them is Pigouvian externalities taxes. So taxing somebody for doing some behavior that's harmful, like pollution. So carbon tax or pollution taxes. The other one is maybe the land tax, because which would be like the government would do a tax on the value of land, with the idea being, well, nobody produced the value of the land. So you're entitled to the products of your own labor, but you didn't produce the land. So why do you get that? So maybe that should be shared by everyone. So maybe the government should have a tax rate that's sort of like, yeah, okay. So, it takes the value of land. So that to me is reasonable. But where we probably disagree, though, might be about, how much that would be, right? Because I think the government would be entitled, or somebody would be entitled to tax the unimproved value of the land. Like if nobody had done anything to increase the value of the land. But I think that's a very small amount. And, the vast majority of economic value produced in the country is produced by work, by somebody doing productive activities.
No, it is interesting. Before you reply, are you both experiencing delays, or are you both experiencing lags, or is that just me?
Not that I've noticed very much. Is it not that I've noticed a lot?
Okay, great. Wonderful. Okay, yeah, carry on.
So yeah, I mean, so I am very much opposed to the right-wing libertarian position, but I'm much more open to the. So Michael said he's open to some of my basic view. Perhaps I'm much more open to the left libertarian position, which essentially says, well, you have a right to your body, you have a right to the fruits of your labor, but you don't have any essential right to the land. You know, we each have a moral claim. So I would be more open to a left libertarian position that says, well, insofar as you have more than an equal share of land, more than an acre in the case of England, you owe compensation to those who have less than an acre. And because, you know, I mean, but so much of it's not just land, natural resources, you know, so much of wealth generation is dependent on land and natural resources. Michael Otsuka, who's a left libertarian, says, you know, tries to imagine a society where you know, you're just generating wealth from your own body, and he talks maybe we could make garments from our body hair or something. And then he thinks the state wouldn't be allowed to tax you in that case. Or, you know, if you're a masseur or a prostitute or something, the state couldn't tax that because you're just using your body. But so much of wealth generation involves the land. So it's a really interesting question that I meant to think more about. Yeah, but how do we value the land? I guess I don't see why we should think it's just 2 points. I guess I don't see why we should think it's just the minimal product, because, you know, someone who owns that land will make profit of it because of its location, the amenities around it, and that you know, that is their right through having the land. And also, you know, also this matters because lots of people are homeless, right? Lots of people have little or nothing. I think they should have a right to an acre of land, right? You know, and the you know, that I can't see how that wouldn't make a huge difference if people had a right to. Well, I guess it depends. Yeah, no, actually, I take that back. Probably about to correct me. There's a difference between a compensation for an acre of land, but.
Yeah, they wouldn't want the land. Like, so, like, you know, like we have homeless people here in Denver, and, you know, if you said, hey, you could have a land up in the mountains, you get an acre up in the mountains, right? They don't want that. They would want money though, right? But, you know, almost all the money that the society has is produced by people doing productive activities, right? And, you know, and I use that very broadly. Not right. So, you know, you might think, well, it's hard to separate out what is the value of the land and what is the value of the activities, because, you know, most things of value require both of those as an absolute necessity. You couldn't produce any at all. So, like, how am I estimating these? But I'm sort of like looking at the prices, you know, in the market. So, you know, like the price for a completely unimproved land, like it's out in the wilderness, there's not even a road. It's like, it's next to zero, right? It's really low. But it's not nothing, so I wouldn't be upset if the government were taxing that. You know, but I don't think it would be as much as the left-wing people want. Like, it wouldn't provide the services that they want.
So what about natural resources? You know, here's a good example. You know, in the UK and Norway both had a lot of oil in the 80s. Now, what Thatcher did with it is use it for tax cuts for the rich, right? And privatize it, right? And sell it off, tax cuts to the rich, and then it was privatized. What the Norwegians did, what? Sorry, I missed that. What the Norwegians did was create a sovereign wealth fund, right? And that is worth, I can't remember now, it's in the trillions, and each Norwegian citizen has access to that. Or what if we think about, you know, a lot of power in England increasingly is wind, water, you know, what about these natural resources? So I think if you're thinking of natural resources as well, then, you know, this potentially makes a big difference.
Yeah. So, you know, natural resources are included in the land, I guess. So, like, if you own some land, then you get to take the oil under it. But, you know, keep in mind that, okay, so, you know, you get a share of the unimproved value of the land. That includes that nobody's done any surveying to find out where the natural resources are, right? So there's going to be some natural resources somewhere in the land. Okay, so then the value of an acre of land is not that much if nobody's surveyed it.
Okay, but that's not what I was thinking of. I was thinking that if someone gets the oil and makes a profit from it, everybody is owed some serious compensation from that, because essentially a very, very large amount of that wealth they've generated is from the oil, right? It's getting tricky now if we're trying to decarbonize, but so I think, like Norway, we should we should have that, right? The people are owed that money.
Yeah. So my thought is, what was the value of that land, including whatever was under it, before anyone had done anything? So nobody had surveys, and nobody had figured out where the oil was. And so, okay. And then, so take the value, the difference between that and the current value of it now that somebody knows, and they have oil derricks or whatever on it. That's a big difference. That difference was made by productive activity. You might disagree with that, but anyway, I want to suggest though that, even if like the government decided that they should get to own the oil, like I think it's reasonable for them to sell it, because like the government isn't an oil company. They're not going to be efficient at extracting it. They should sell it. And then they could take that money and then they can use it for public projects. And, you should expect them to be able to sell it for whatever it's worth. Right. And there would be better than them trying to run run the oil extraction.
Okay, cool. So on the first point, I think we've finally found a philosophical disagreement. Why is that the way to do it? Just, the way to value it just before anyone knew there was oil there or something. Like if I owned some oil privately, I could sell that for a phenomenal amount without having to do anything with it, right? Because companies, they're adding some value. I think we should think, what is the value that's added by what people are doing with their labor, and what is the value that's in some sense inherent in the oil and what you can do with the oil. So I think we should think of it more like people are owed what a private person would get if they sell the oil. So that's the philosophical issue. Okay, and then we're coming back to our empirical disagreement about how much we trust the government. Another economist I'm a big fan of. I'm not an economist. I read a lot of, popular economics books. Ha-Joon Chang, economist at Cambridge, who's he's got an interesting book, Bad Samaritans, or 23 Things They Never Tell You About Capitalism. Great books that were a big influence on me. That almost every country that has reached prosperity has had a long period of protectionism, of the state deciding how the economy works. I mean, his own example of South Korea, he says, he grew up in essentially the poverty levels of Dickensian Britain. And when he grew up, he had this modern economy. And what happened was, right, on his account, the West said, what you're good at fishing. Stick to fishing. That's what you're good at. And we'll provide all your cars and stuff. And they said, no, we want to make cars. We want to make steel. So we're going to stick tariffs on everything, and we're going to have governments decide which industries we're going to focus on. And look, they're as rich as us now, pretty much. And, I suspect a lot of the reason a lot of the developing world has been kept in poverty is because they've been pressured by the West to open up markets to Western companies and not do what South Korea did. That's certainly Ha-Joon Chang's argument that I find quite persuasive. And, you look at like China is incredibly successful. It has that mix of, yes, there's markets there. It's not old school, totally top-down communism, but the state is providing a huge role in shaping industry and deciding which industrial planning. So I guess we're back to empirical considerations, but I'm really not convinced it's so easy as, government bad. That was a Reagan slogan, wasn't it? And yeah, I just think, don't you think things are pretty messed up at the moment?
But I
Michael,
think
could you just respond to this?
Yeah. Sorry, what?
Sorry. I was just going to say, could you get the last word on this issue? I'll give Philip the last word on the next issue.
If it's the last word
after this.
Can I ask a different question instead, or unless Michael really wants to answer that question? Can I ask a different question instead?
Sure.
I guess I'm really,
yeah.
I'm surprised how open Michael is to this sort of rule utilitarian view of property rights, and how open he is to rectifying historical injustice. So I want to ask, why don't you talk about that more in your work? You've got this huge book, say, focusing on, look, taxation is theft. This is the big issue. This is what we need to focus on. We need to get rid of government. Why not focus on, rectifying historical injustice and dealing with
not
these
all about
these,
taxation. I mean, it's about how the state doesn't have any authority, but affects a whole bunch of government policies. Why didn't I spend more time talking about rectification? It's partly because it's a hard problem that I don't know the answer to. I really don't know what we should do about that. Another thing, though, is, I kind of think that, I think that most of the value that people produce and consume in a given year is due to the labor done in that year, productive activities more generally. It's not mostly due to the land value. And like all or almost all of the land was stolen at some point in the past. But I think that the rectification of that wouldn't make a huge difference, given that most value is produced by current productive activities. There's property rights violations going on today also. And so I guess, if you count the government's property rights violations, then they're pretty big. But the ones by non-government agents are not that big. So I don't think they would make a huge difference in the distribution.
But just one more, Amos, and then I'll get. But it's coming back to the philosophical issue. It seems to me such a big gap in your argument if you haven't ruled out the possibility of sort of these kind of rule utilitarian-esque socially constructed property rights, because then it's an empirical question whether we should make property rights subject to taxation, and then obviously by definition taxation wouldn't be theft. So that it just seems it seems like a big gap in the argument that would need to be closed, don't you think? That either empirically or it collapses into an empirical question.
Yeah, but the empirical question whether taxation is beneficial or not. Actually, because
and then thereby, if we have this rule utilitarian-esque conception of property rights, if taxation is beneficial, then property rights should come bundled up with taxes, and so by definition, taxation isn't theft. So that's sorry, I'm repeating myself.
Consider the example where you steal a loaf of bread to feed your sister's kid. So that's beneficial overall, and it's justified, but it's still theft. So, and I don't know, I don't know what I don't have the complete ethical theory, so I don't know exactly what's going on. In some cases, a justified property transfer will be still called theft. In other cases, it won't be. So that stealing the loaf of bread, that's still theft, even though it was justified. And then, but there's things like, let's say there's somebody who, committed a tort and they owe compensation to the defendant and they're refusing to pay it. And then somebody forces them to pay. So that's a non-voluntary property transfer. And you would not call that theft. And it's not exactly clear to me why sometimes it's theft and sometimes it isn't, even if it's justified. But I guess I would say, what the government is doing looks to me more like the guy with the loaf of bread rather than taking the compensation, right? Because they're taking money from all of us and we don't owe compensation. We didn't do anything wrong. And they're just taking it because, they think they're providing a greater good. That looks to me like the guy who's saying, I'm taking this bread because I need it.
But if so you're saying, well, it's theft. Is it justified theft? But if this rule utilitarian-esque theory of property rights is correct, and if taxation is beneficial, then it's just not theft. Because according to this theory, we should go for the system of property rights that protects and promotes what's important. And if that involves bundling up property rights, making property rights conditional on the payment of tax, that's what we should go for. And then by the definition of those property rights, taxation isn't theft. So it's not just oh, taxation is theft, so is it justified or not? It's like you're open to a view which, subject to certain empirical considerations, entails that taxation is just not theft, that's a kind of category mistake.
But yeah, so like I think I have to clarify meta-ethical or methodological points, like, because like I approach ethics differently from, I believe, most philosophers. Like most philosophers, especially if they said they liked rule utilitarianism, their approach would be start from rule utilitarianism, and then I'm going to deduce the rest of my ethical views from that. And my view is sort of the reverse. So there's sort of like common sense ethical judgments, and the rule utilitarian theory has to be adjusted so that it gets those. Okay, so like if there's a firm judgment that like the theft of the loaf of bread is still theft, and like so the rule utilitarian theory is going to need to be adjusted so that it explains that. I don't know exactly how this works, right? But like I'm fairly confident that our intuitions are getting at something. And of course, I could be wrong. Intuitions are fallible and all that, but I assume that they're getting at something, and then like my general ethical theory is going to have to explain that.
But no, I'm sympathetic to that methodology, right? But then I think, why do you go for Locke, right? Because Locke cannot make sense. I mean, I wouldn't mind knowing your response actually to the school teacher point, right? On a Lockean view, the school teacher has only stolen money and has no right to their money. So why'd you go for Locke? Now you might say to me, just before you answer, just one more point, you might say to me, well, your view might not make sense to that either, because if presumably the correct socially constructed property rights aren't the ones we have, so shouldn't it be okay to just steal from people? I think actually, I was just thinking this today, like anticipating our conversation. I think if you want to capture common sense morality, you're probably going to have to accept a right to obey the law, right? Because I think that's probably the only way to justify it, right? Why is it not okay to steal from the school teacher? Because it's against the law. And now I agree that we couldn't say property rights are totally dependent on the law. So maybe it's like,
did you mean the duty to obey the law?
Yeah, what did I say? A duty.
You said a right to obey the law.
Sorry. I meant right. Thanks for the correction. A right to obey the law, because maybe the correct system. I think if you want to capture, here's how you capture common sense morality, right? Property rights are socially constructed, but you should have in mind, your ideal socially constructed property rights. But then you got to be pragmatic about it, right? And so if you're in a democratic society where it's not too unjust, then you should accept and so that gets around the hermit case, because in that case you don't have this, but then you should accept the legally legislated, it's a bit of a tautology, property rights, and push democratically for your ideal system. I think that would, so I put to you, if you're interested in common sense morality, I think that would get you common sense morality. That would get you shouldn't steal from the school teacher. Whereas the Lockean view is just wild. So yeah, you shouldn't go for Locke if you're interested in common sense morality.
What is the Lockean view anyway? Like, well, so if we had a world where nobody was committing injustices, then the Lockean view works fine. So you might think, it's like it's got a theory about that case, and then there's like you need a principle of rectification, which we haven't really worked out. And so okay, but the principle of rectification is going to have to take into account sort of like utilitarian considerations, like what is the good. So given that there's super widespread violations of the pure property rights, given that, what is the most useful rule for how you're supposed to respond to that? So probably if the rule was you see anybody where there's any injustice in the history of how they acquire their property, you got to take it from them. That doesn't sound like a good rule. I don't think society is going to work well if that's the system, right? That's my initial thought, and it's I don't know what we should do. Okay, so you might think, oh well, these school teachers they're a particularly bad case because 100% of their salary, but everybody's got everybody's property has been affected by the injustices that people are constantly doing. So can I just take property from anyone at any time? That better not be it. I don't know what the right answer is, but that doesn't sound right.
Yeah. So, but it just seems like, but how do you make sense of that as a Lockean? That, I mean, what do we say about the school teacher?
Um,
How do we make sense of her having a claim on her money?
oh, well, I'm not like, so the guy gave sort of like this rural utilitarian comment. Okay, is rural utilitarianism consistent with Lockean, whatever, property rights theory? I don't know, maybe it's not. Like, I don't care if that's not Lockean. I'm not wedded to that label.
Was there something else you wanted to talk about, Amos, or should we carry on?
So I was wondering, just before we wrap up, if we could get a bit more engagement on the hermit case. I thought that hasn't been explored yet.
Yeah, how does that work? Why is it not okay to take his stuff?
So I think I would say Michael's influenced me on this point, that I was a fan of the Nagel-Murphy, and I think he makes a good point that it can't be that they're entirely dependent on the law. It's straightforward. But then I think Michael goes too far the other way, saying, okay, so they're nothing to do with the law. But I mean, although you do have this mix of actually, to be fair, you have this mix of natural and conventional. But I'm not sure we have to go to, but I think it's too quick to say, oh, we have to go to natural property rights. You can say, well, they're social constructions that should be as I've laid out, shaped by other moral considerations. But you could bring the law back in. And as I say, I think if you want to capture common sense morality, I think you probably should. You probably say, if you've got a law, and the government's democratic and not too unjust, then you should respect the laws and try and push democracy. I think, as I say, I think that would most capture common sense. But obviously that raises problems for your anarchy and your claim that taxation is theft.
So maybe the view could be like, maybe there are natural property rights if the government isn't there, but then the government gets to override them. Like, if there is a government making laws, then their rules override what the sort of default rules. Maybe that would be how it works.
I mean, I would say these socially constructed things, if you want to say they're natural property rights, then
no, because it could be traditions. It doesn't have to be a government law. But what if you're in a society where the law is that people get to own other people, right? Which is not purely hypothetical. That was like an actual thing, known as slavery. So it just, do you have to obey that? Is that a legitimate property right?
Yeah, very good point. So it's well, what I did say was, if it's not too unjust, I guess I would think you have to bear both of these things in mind. You have to have property rights, like Jesus said about the Sabbath. Property rights are made for us, not us for property rights. We shouldn't fetishize them. And I think it's such a temptation. I think probably common sense morality does imbue property rights with a certain significance that I don't think they have. It's a sort of illusion there. But anyway, we should have our ideal. There's social constructions that should serve us, and we should have in our minds the ideal system we think would most would be the perfect society. But also you've got to be a bit pragmatic about it. So you respect the law if it's not too unjust, like it would be with slavery, and you try to get closer to your system. I guess that would be my view. And so I hope that would deal with the slavery issue. That would be like a massive injustice. So then you're
permitted
to override the law.
So I mean, you might think it's an injustice because nobody, in fact, has rights over other people, right? But if the government is defining what the property rights are, why can't they just define it that way? And that's not an injustice. Now you might just like have a utilitarian response, like it will cause a lot of suffering. So.
Yeah, because property rights have their moral value, their moral significance from other considerations. Like people having the right to life, for example, people having the right to autonomy. And I've got an undergraduate writing a dissertation at the moment defending a sort of semi-libertarian view. Ella Davey, give a shout out for her. She might listen to this. That we have rights over our bodies and our labor, a sort of pure left libertarianism in a way, but everything else is socially constructed. And So yeah, that would be
Yeah.
one way around it. Or just, just have a right. You have a right to life and autonomy, or we could talk about human flourishing.
Okay,
So yeah,
yeah. I mean, libertarians like to say that you have a property right in yourself, like you own your body, and that's that's just one example of the property rights. That's a natural property right. So,
I'm certainly open to that property right. Yeah, but yeah, I'm gonna think. I mean, it's interesting this coming back to this distinction about how we value the land. If I could think more about that. That's an interesting thing that's come out of this interaction. One interesting
yeah.
thing.
Well, yeah. So I was uncertain about how you should calculate the value of the land. So if there was a plot of land in Denver with nothing on it, like there's an empty lot, it's worth a lot of money actually, as opposed to the plot of land in the wilderness. So does the government get to tax the value of the plot of land in Denver? All right. Or do they have to try to figure out what it would be if there weren't any buildings around it? And it was not obvious to me what the answer to that is on a sort of like Georgist philosophy. So yeah, because the value of that empty land in Denver, so that's mostly produced by human activity, but not the activity of the owner of that plot of land.
So wait, just coming back to oil, coming back to that again. I mean, if my family own oil, I'm going to take it that I have commonsensically, I have a right to what the market value of that oil. And I think you'd probably agree with that. So why isn't it the same, right? So if we think, no, the oil is owned by everybody in the country, let's say, to keep it simple, why doesn't everyone have an equal claim on the market value of the oil?
Oh yeah, so I mean, take the value of, so there's some land that in fact has oil under it, but nobody's done any productive activities, which means nobody actually knows. Okay, so yeah, so they get the value, they get the whatever the country as a whole gets to share the market value of the land when they don't know what's under it.
But why do you think that? Why is that different? Because in the private case, you have a right to the market value, don't you? You could sell it for the market. So why doesn't?
Yes,
but
the market value would reflect people's actual knowledge. So if it in fact has oil under it, but you don't know that, then yeah, you can sell it for market value.
Yeah, so you're right that it has the value it does because of its interaction with the man-made world. But still, in the private case, we'd say, look, I have a right to that, even though I haven't done anything. I haven't dug up the oil. I don't have the knowledge.
Yeah.
But I have the right to sell it for a fortune. So I just don't see why it's not the same for.
Well, yeah. So if they're taking the land tax, the government presumably would take a tax on the value of all of the land in the country. All right, but the unimproved value of all the land. Okay, and so then you could say, well, so what is our expectation about how much oil is going to be under the country, right? And that would affect what the value of the land was, right? But it's the value before anyone's done surveying to figure out exactly where that oil is, right? Because that's a lot less than if they do know where it is. If you do know where it is, then you know where to build the oil derricks and stuff like that.
Okay, so this seems to be a crucial disagreement. I don't see why we should do it that way. And this is important because I am open to a left libertarian view, and it seems in some sense you are, but the difference is you think, well, it doesn't really matter because it wouldn't be worth that much. Whereas I think potentially, and it's interesting because I think you could really get people on board with this in principle. If you get, it's like the kind of thing I've been mostly talking about, like property, social construction, and so that's pretty abstract. It's hard to get people on board with that. But if you say, look, we each have an equal claim on the land. Why should some duke have acres and acres and acres because of his great grandparent was friends with William the Conqueror? That makes sense to people. Yeah. So I can imagine a popular Georgist, referring to Henry George there, who had these ideas. I had a name for it in one article I made, universal rent. So maybe that's not a sexy name. Like, we think of people who have a lot of land, we're not going to take it off them. We're not the Soviet Union. but they owe us rent. They're renting it from society. And I think if I'm right and you're wrong, that, you know, how we should value the land, that's potentially a huge universal basic income for everybody. And, you know, another thing, that universal basic income can be counterintuitive as well, because people think, well, why should you give people money for free, money for nothing? But if you think we have a right to the land, we're owed that money. I mean, I can imagine a popular political campaign that, you know, has a transformative impact through this idea of we've got a claim on the land and we're going to use that to fund a significant universal basic income. I think it's, you know, it's these kind of ideas we really need, or, you know, you're about, you know, I think we're in danger of far right governments because people are rudderless, and, you know, I think we need something like this. And anyway.
Okay, well, I'm not sure about that part, but what's the problem with overvaluing the land? And so, you know, it's sort of like the underlying, I don't know, my underlying idea was about how property rights create the right incentives. So, and if you overvalue the land, then you're going to sort of mess up the incentives, right? So, like, you might lower the incentives for people to do surveying work, find out where oil is, or, you know, whatever has to be done, you know, to get at the oil. You want the people to get a reward for that that's proportional to how much reward society will reap when it happens, right? And so, you know, what is that reward? Well, it's the difference between the starting state when nobody's done anything, and then the state where somebody's taken the oil out. And that, you know, you want people to get reward for every step along the way and proportionately. So.
It's very interesting. Why don't I let Michael have the last word on that? And I'm going to have to feed my children on the hour. So maybe we should come to closing statements, or what do you think, Amos?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Am I supposed to give a closing statement? I think I think my statement is just repeating myself, but I guess I'll do it anyway. So I take it that there's at least some degree of natural property rights, which means, you know, there's some sort of claim that people have on their stuff that's not solely dependent on the government granting it to them. And that's shown by, you know, hypothetical examples where you imagine somebody who's not in the jurisdiction of the government, but they've done some productive stuff, you know, with natural resources that didn't belong to anyone else. And then it seems like it's wrong to just take their stuff or damage it or whatever. And so now, you know, when we think about, well, what is the justification for property rights? Like, I hypothesize, I'm not sure of this, but I hypothesize that there's a real utilitarian rationale, which is something like, look, we need a system for how resources get distributed, and like who gets to decide what use the resources put to. And that's what a property right is, right? It's the right to decide what use some resources put to. And then how do we distribute it? Well, we want to distribute them in such a way as to create the right incentives for people to do productive activities and not unproductive activities. And so, like, we want people to build stuff, or like we want people to plant crops on land, but we don't want people to do things like try to extract value from other people. You don't want people doing stuff like, somebody else has planted on land, I'm going to go over there and take their food, right? Because that's not productive. That doesn't increase the amount of value, right? There's a lot of, you know, like in political philosophy, there's a lot of people worrying about how to distribute the resources. But, you know, if there's a shortage of stuff, there are people who are poor, that means there's a shortage of resources. Whatever it is, when there's a shortage of something valuable, the main thing you should be thinking about is, how do we get more of it? The main thing you should be thinking about isn't how do we distribute the amount that we have, right? Because the ideal situation is that there won't be a shortage, and then people won't have to complain about not having enough or whatever. So if there's enough of it, you know, then they want, okay. And so that's why the primary focus of property rights should be how to get the incentives right to make it so that people want to produce more. Because people are selfish, that means they have to get rewards that are proportional to the value that they're contributing, right? Which I'm sort of measuring as the marginal value, the difference between the value that existed before they did some activity and the value that existed in society afterwards. So, okay, then, you know, well, taxation might be justified because it's necessary to preserve the whole system, and like that's a thing that we could have a debate about. But it doesn't look like we have to do this. We have to do the taxation just to like redistribute, just to give to the poor people, right? And that I think messes up the incentives more than necessary. Right. So that's all.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, this is very interesting. It's stimulated a lot of thought in me. I think I like Michael's work. Very big picture thinker, the kind I like of, not doing little, pedantic journal articles on pedantic points. So, what I've learned from this and what I'm surprised by is, we kind of, in a way, have the same view. And I'm just in the closing statement, actually, I've just kind of come to me in a clearer way that you're open to thinking of natural property rights as justified in this sort of rule utilitarian sense in more fundamental moral considerations. And so then, but then I think it collapses into an empirical question whether we should make those property rights subject to taxation. Like if that is the best way to promote and protect what we care about, then it follows that by definition those property rights are subject to taxation. So it does seem to me there's a kind of big hole in the argument that taxation is theft. If you're open to thinking of, given that we're both open to thinking of property rights in this rule utilitarian-esque sense, then coming to the so then Michael says, well, on that empirical question, we should be thinking largely not about the distribution, but the size of the pie. Well, I just think recent history defies that, because in the 30 years after the war and the 40 years since, my lifetime is when it's all gone shit, in my opinion. I was born in the winter of discontent when Thatcher came to power. The pie was kind of the same. In fact, it was bigger. It was fucking bigger. Sorry, I got a bit carried away there. It was bigger in the post-war years. What was different was the distribution. We had, we had strong trade unions, we had high tax at the top, which meant that workers got more of the pie, right? They were more expensive. Then we ditched all that, and you've got these runaway CEO salaries and, dividends that more of the pie goes up. So I think that is defied by research. And I would just encourage, obviously it's complex empirical considerations. I would encourage people themselves to look into that, read Piketty, read Hajun Chang, read other people on the other side as well. Yes. Yeah, finally the land issue. So that's interesting, right? That we both agree that in some sense people have a moral claim on the land. That's much more. It's much less intuitive, the first come first served right-wing libertarian idea than it is with your body, that you have a right over your body. And it depends about how we value the land as to whether we could really get something out of this. I still don't see. Just finally, Michael was given a sort of empirical justification there. Well, if we don't think about whether there's oil there, then people won't develop it and stuff. But they will, because it doesn't matter. I'm just talking about keeping the society we have. So people still have the incentives to go and develop it. I'm just talking about philosophically what do we owe society? And I still don't see why it shouldn't be different to what a private owner of oil would expect to get from it. I just don't see why it should be any different. And so yeah, left libertarianism, I think, has a lot of potential. I think the social constructivism is ultimately more plausible, but the left libertarian view could change society. And we really are heading off a cliff, in my view. I'm very worried. I think Keir Starmer's about to come into government here, change nothing, and then we'll get a far right government after that. That's my prediction. I'm very worried. We need to do something.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Thank you for watching, and if you just like, subscribe, and comment, that would be wonderful. Thank you both for coming on.
Thanks. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Amos. That was really good, fun, interesting.